Father Ben Crosby, thank you so much for taking the time for this today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm really excited to have you on today. I first came across your work through an interview you did on another channel called All Things Necessary, where you were talking about the Re-Confessionalization of the Anglican Church. And then since I've kind of gone down a rabbit hole, I always forget what the actual saying is, on your Substack, where you've talked not only about Re-Confessionalization, but Re-Christianization of the Anglican Church, which is all really interesting and ideas that hit home to me. I want to start with this idea of Re-Confessionalization. So, at the base level, there's a couple of things going on there. The re implies that we're getting back to something. But I want to just start even before that with, what does it mean to be a confessional church?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's, a couple of ways that you could think about this, right? I think at the broadest level, you can talk about a church as being confessional or having a confession, simply meaning that it has a set standard of doctrine of some sort or another. It might also mean, and in this way it's typically used to refer to the churches that emerge from the Reformation in the 16th century and beyond, to be a church that is in some way, that doesn't just have doctrine, but is sort of oriented around or grounded in a particular articulation of the gospel. So, again, broad definition, it's to say that a church has a doctrine. Narrower definition, it's that this doctrine is seen as doing sort of both ecclesiological and, I guess, sort of identity forming work for that given church body.
Okay, that's helpful. And it already gives a bit of a distinction in my mind, because when I think of confessional churches, I think of like the Lutheran Church, where they have like
Mm-hmm.
the Augsburg Confession, or you have kind of the Book of Concord, you have really detailed doctrinal standards to which kind of the ministers are held. When you talk about reconfessionalization in the Anglican context, do you mean it in the broader sense, the narrower sense, or both?
Yeah, I think I would probably say both, really. I mean, I would argue without suggesting that the Church of England is what I guess we're talking about, sort of emerging in the 16th century, the kind of birth of Anglicanism in this Reformation moment, without suggesting that this church was exactly in every respect like its sort of sister Reformation churches. I do think that the Church of England emerged from its Reformation with a set, discrete standard of doctrine to which ministers were expected to subscribe, and in that it's actually less different than I think we often think. Those of us who are Anglicans or Episcopalians, anyway, often think from other Reformed churches or Lutheran churches, things like that.
Yeah, it seems to me, especially in the Episcopal Church, that a lot of people are drawn to it because they feel it's precisely the opposite of confessional in a way, that they think like, oh, this is a place where there's less boundaries, where, there's more leeway on things. I don't feel kind of tied down to a certain articulation of this, whatever it might be. So how did we get there compared to having a more, you know, robust sense of Anglicanism, or, the Episcopal Church is doctrinal, it's defined, at least in part, doctrinally by the beliefs that have traditionally been held, or confessed, shall we say. How did we get where we are?
Yeah, this is a really great and complicated question. I think something that's worth bearing in mind from the beginning is that I think a lot of people, especially in the States, maybe North America broadly, when they think about a confessional church, they're operating out of the framework of sort of post-establishment voluntary churches, if this makes sense, where you might have a confession as something that it is not just ministers that are expected to subscribe to, but lay people as well. And there's just a very strong sense that a set of beliefs sort of determines pretty much everything you need to know about a given church. I think it's important to remember that when we're talking about the state churches that emerged from the 16th century that are confessional by I think any reasonable definition of the term, they are also always going to be a little bit broader than, I don't know, the stereotype of a certain sort of free church Presbyterianism or something that lives in a lot of our heads, just because these churches had, ostensibly and often in practice, either all or almost the entire body of a given polity as members, right? And so I think, without denying that embracing a confession means accepting some norms and some restrictions on how we talk about God, and thinking that that is a good thing, I think that too easy of a dichotomy between having a confession and a certain amount of capaciousness is, I think, a mistake in historical terms. But with that long sort of episode in throat clearing out of the way, to give you sort of a brief historical sketch. So when I talk about the kind of standards of Anglican doctrine, just to get very, very concrete here, I mean the Articles of Religion, so the 39 articles that are sort of put forth in 1563 and published in their final form by 1571. The Ordinal in the Book of Common Prayer, which dates back to the reign of Edward, and the prayer book itself, the sort of 1662 being the sort of prayer book that the Church of England stuck with, and that prayer book being a relatively minor revision of a prayer book that was developed about a century earlier, 1552, also in the reign of Edward, with this authorized sermon collection called the Two Books of Homilies as a sort of adjacent, not quite as authoritative, but also sort of one of the, you hear Anglicans talk about the formularies, and this is what we mean. And of these formularies, at least in the 16th century, the articles were quite clearly seen as the one that defined doctrine. I mean, that's what they are, what they aim to be. It's not a liturgy, it's a doctrinal statement. Over the course of Anglican history, even those who want an Anglicanism normed by these formularies, the sort of various ranking that one or the other of them might have, might switch a bit. But at any rate, when the articles are developed, for about the first century or so, after, maybe even more, 2 centuries after, the biggest opposition to the articles is from people we might think as super low church or radical Protestants. So there are, the people that we think of as Puritans. We can talk about that term. There's some problems with it, but for now we'll use it. And they, on one hand, thought that the articles and these formularies broadly, in some ways, said too much. They didn't like that one of the articles of religion demands sort of recognition of the acceptability of the ordinal, because they did not like it. They wanted a Presbyterian polity, many of them, rather than governance by bishops. So it says too much about things like the ordinal. On the other hand, it doesn't say enough, in their view, about some of the controversies that emerge in Reformed theology towards the end of the 16th century. So the thing about the articles, right? And apologies if we're going too far down a church history rabbit hole here. But the thing about the articles, okay, good. So they're, as I said, written in the 1560s, mostly based off of earlier document called the 42 Articles of Religion that Archbishop of Cranmer put together in the 1550s. And so because this is the case, they generally reflect a kind of broad, lightly, although clearly reformed, but sort of broad Protestant consensus on questions of salvation, of the church, of scripture, of sacraments, things like this. And so the sort of debates that the Reformed or Calvinist tradition is often associated with questions like the extent of Christ's atonement, the resistibility or irresistibility of grace, sort of various details about predestination, any mention or any clear mention anyway of sort of double predestination, of a decree of reprobation in which God, not only elects some people to be saved, but also elects some people to be damned. The articles don't talk about any of that. And that's because of the time when they were written. You look at other Reformed statements of faith written around the same time, Second Helvetic, Scott's Confession, it's the same. But by the end of Elizabeth's reign, 1570s, 80s, 90s, there are all these other debates in the Reformed world, and there were a set of sort of low church, these kind of Protestant radicals who wanted the articles to be really specific about, to affirm double predestination, to affirm, these think of as Reformed distinctives that don't show up in the articles because they were written before they became Reformed distinctives. And so basically, the first little while, a couple centuries, there's a concern from low church folks, radical Protestants, that the articles say too much about the wrong things, mostly church order, and don't say enough about these kind of Reformed theological distinctives. In fact, sort of the Presbyterian party in the Church of England felt this so strongly that when the monarchy was overthrown, the articles were ditched, and the reason that the Westminster Confession of Faith was drawn up in the 17th century was to replace them. The articles, along with the prayer book, along with the ordinal, come back with the restoration of the monarchy and governance by bishops in the 1660s. There's some sort of additional pressure from here, less from the sort of committed kind of Presbyterian Puritan party, because they mostly left the Church of England, but more from people who are at least accused by their opponents of being Arians, of not sort of fully holding the Christology of the creeds or councils, who again think, well, it says a little too much, but in this kind of very biblicist sort of radical Protestant direction. Things change dramatically in the 19th century, and then really from then till now, sort of nervousness about the articles or the formularies broadly tends to be associated less with the kind of low church side of the theological spectrum and more the high church side. And so here, the Anglo-Catholicism, the Oxford movement, a group of members of, well, first the Church of England, then kind of Anglicanism broadly, who really saw as their goal a conformity of the Church of England to Catholicism as they understood it, which largely meant rejecting most distinctives of the Reformation and seeking to return either to a putative patristic sort of consensus, we're just going to do what the fathers did, or sort of conformity to contemporary Roman Catholicism, the contemporary Roman Catholicism of their day. For those who were committed to that project, the articles, the other formularies too, but especially the articles, because they were so clearly Protestant on questions like scripture, the church, or salvation, they started to seem like a problem. And so it was then from that party that you saw sort of an increasing push to make them less important. And then I think in the late 19th through to the 20th centuries, it's really the sort of combination of a Anglo-Catholic party that is very doctrinally committed, but whose doctrine is not that of the articles or of the formularies in general, and a sort of liberal theological party that is, how should I put this, less concerned perhaps about doctrinal specificity and thinks that such specificity can get in the way of sharing the gospel in modernity, to try to give sort of a generous read of what they're up to. So I think those two parties together sort of ended up rather seriously diminishing the place of the articles, the formularies as a whole, in the English Church and Anglicanism broadly. And so the kind of denouement is in the middle of the 20th century. You have Lambeth Conference, which is this once every 10 years gathering of all the bishops from across the Anglican communion saying, clergy should not subscribe to the articles. And you also have around the same time the Church of England changing its oath of subscription to, instead of saying, I subscribe in some sense to the articles of religion or these other formularies, the prayer book, the ordinal, it's, I confess the Christian faith to which the formularies bear witness. So kind of a diminishing of their place. And that more or less brings us, I think, to where we are now. There are a group of us, I think, especially associated with sort of more conservative, in some ways, kind of breakaway Anglican groups, but not only. I mean, I'm ordained in the Episcopal Church, and I'm glad to be there, who are sort of taking another look at these. But to give, I apologize, a perhaps more long-winded answer than you wanted. There's your, in 10 minutes, or was it 15? Goodness, my little sketch of the place of the articles in Anglican history.
Hey, I hope you guys are enjoying this video, but one thing I know people don't always enjoy is the ads that go with these videos. Now look, ads are how YouTubers like me are able to pay the bills, but if you want to watch these videos early, ad-free, and with my post-show reflections at the end, you can do so by becoming a patron at any tier by going to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. From $7 a month to $100 a month, your support helps this channel keep going and growing, and not only will you get early ad-free access to these interviews, but you will also get access to the Gospel Simplicity Book Club, where we read the Church Fathers together, and it is an absolute blast. So if you want those perks and others, go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. No, that was fascinating. I was sitting here thinking I have the perfect guest for these questions. I'm glad you were able to go through that so well. And what's really fascinating to me is that the way in which the articles have been deemed problematic to people of very different theological persuasions at different times. And I was reflecting on this just today. I was reading an article about a schism within one of the kind of continuing Anglican churches in the U.S. I'm not well read enough on it to name names or to get into the details of it. But what was interesting to me was that this very conservative movement was not going to be requiring kind of adherence to the 39 articles, which I would have thought would be a more conservative thing to do. Like, well, these are your standards of faith. But it's interesting to see that that's not a new thing, that it's kind of come from both sides in that. And it seems to connect to this other idea of Re-Christianization that you've talked about for the Anglican Church. And I liberal, conservative, there's all types of problems in using those words, but people understand, I think, what we mean by that. And it seems like more theologically, this would be directed more towards the theologically liberal side of it, or maybe it would be equally. I'll let you answer that. But when you say we need to re-Christianize the Anglican Church, what do you mean by that? That might seem like a really interesting thing to people who would have assumed that a church would be that already.
Yeah, what a great question. So I think, yes, so to speak to my context, and I think the people that I'm, glad for anyone to read it and hope and pray they will find it in some ways useful. But in terms of, I guess, who it's directed for or who I'm speaking to, it's very much kind of mainline Anglicanism, if you will. So I'm, as I said, ordained in the Episcopal Church in the United States, currently serving a parish in the Anglican Church of Canada. Have spent some time in the Church of England as well. So that's really kind of my Anglican world primarily, if that makes sense. And I think what I mean by it, and it may sound a little, yes, polemical or surprising. Well, don't we expect churches to be Christian? But I guess maybe the simplest way to put it is it's a call for us to actually be who we say we are. That's one way we could put it, maybe. And more broadly, it's a diagnosis that although these churches are, on paper, um, sort of small o orthodox in the sense of committed to the creeds. That if you look at their liturgies by and large, their books of prayers, it seems like they are, and indeed many parishes are, kind of fulsomely Christian. But that in practice, I think we have two things going on that are problems, in response to which I think something like Re-Christianization is called for. The first is people, and specifically sort of clergy, and especially bishops, um, denying or soft pedaling sort of key aspects of the gospel. In some ways, I think one of the reasons that I am hopeful about the future of my church is that I think it actually happens a little less than it did a few decades ago. But I mean, names like John Shelby Spong often come up, right? Who's this Episcopal bishop of Newark, who was very good at writing bestsellers to the extent that essentially said, this is all of this Christianity thing is basically a human invention that is sort of useful for helping us get through life and sort of for particular political or social ends. But is it actually true that Jesus rose from the dead? Probably not, right? Like this kind of thing. As I said, less than it used to be, but still around. I've still encountered it. I think the bigger problem, which is I'm still working on finding the right language for it, to be honest, but I think the bigger problem is places that really struggle at keeping the main thing, as it were, that put the proclamation of the good news of the salvation won for us by Jesus Christ, at the heart of what they do. Places where, if anyone asks, if you ask the priest, "Oh, do you believe this?" They'll say, "Well, yeah, of course I do." But if you look at what's actually, talked about from the pulpit, if you looked at the sort of shape of the Christian life that parishioners are invited to try into, to try on, to inhabit, that it just doesn't look very much like something traditionally Christian, right? Like there's a lot of kind of center left, social and political commentary, which, frankly, politically speaking, I more or less agree with, as it were, but I don't actually think that's what the church is here to do. Reducing Christianity to a sort of moral exhortation that more or less ends with being, I don't know, supporting the sort of things or doing the sort of things that the kind of stereotypical NPR listener does. Like those might all be very, very good things to do. I like NPR, but I think that the church is aimed at something different. One of a text that I come back to a lot, actually, which if you have not recommend, I will shamelessly take advantage of being on mic here to recommend to you, is Martin Luther's "What to Look For and Expect in the Gospels." It's a little preface he wrote to a sermon collection that he put out in the 1520s, if memory serves, and he distinguishes between um, receiving Christ as a gift and receiving Christ as an example. And receiving Christ as an example is taking Christ as, well, as sort of what it sounds like, a kind of moral example for you to follow as you go through life. And that's a good thing to do. It's a good thing to take Christ as your example. But what Luther says, and I think he's right, and I think this is exactly what a lot of churches miss, is that before you can take Christ as your example, you have to receive Christ as a gift, as God for you, as the one in whom your salvation is found, independent of your own efforts and actions and deserving. And this is at the heart of what I mean by Re-Christianization, that rather than a kind of image of the Christian life taught from the pulpit, enacted, that is primarily about following, well, itself a frankly somewhat attenuated vision of Christ as example. It's reclaiming Christ as gift, as God for us, and then because we've received that gift, being able to go out and love and serve our neighbor. The thing that the church, anybody can say, go do good works. The thing, it's a good thing to say, but anyone can say it. The thing that the church has to offer, and I think the thing that I fear our church often doesn't offer as clearly as it could, is Jesus.
Well, this I have so much to say about all of this. This is so exciting. I really enjoy the direction of where this thinking is going. And you talked a little bit about some of the kind of like glimmers of hope that you're seeing here. And I want to talk about, yeah, like what does this look like on the ground level? Because on the one hand, I see at least kind of two forces that are maybe helping and hurting this. And I'm sure you've seen more because you've been thinking about this longer than I have. On the one hand, it does seem that a certain kind of like broad re-Christianization is probably already happening and it seems like it will continue to happen. If for nothing else, then I don't see the non-Christian forms of Christianity, if you will, gaining much traction. Like that seems like what's dying the fastest, if you will. And I think of even figures who within the Episcopal Church that many might think of as like very socially liberal. Thinking of like, I don't know if you know Rev Lizzie from Instagram. She has a podcast and also with you. But they were talking the other day about like, we are Christians. Like, and they were talking about the distinctiveness of being Christian. And I was like, even these people that people on the outside might view as like, wow, that's very progressive. I think there is a desire like, hey, if we're going to keep doing this thing, like, let's do it as Christians, like, or else what are we doing here? On the other hand, I think the Episcopal Church, at least in America, or I'll start more broadly, I think the church in America is incredibly politically divided. And it seems that the Episcopal Church is becoming, for a lot of people, like a post-deconstruction option of continuing to do church, where liberal politics are going to be affirmed. And I think for some people, as they see other churches seem to go further right, they want the church to kind of go further left and make that message more of the main thing. Because it's like, hey, if they're going to be, talking about Christian nationalism all the time, we need to be talking about liberal, progressive, social issues all the time. Those are at least two factors that I see kind of going into this as far as, is this going to be on the rise? Is it going to struggle? I'd be curious what you make of those and what you think, generally speaking, of like, is this the direction we're heading? Are we heading in a different direction? What does it look like to make this happen?
Yeah, these are great questions. I think to the first, I have also seen that, and I sort of deep think, hope, but would want, I don't know, some real survey data or something to see to sort of assure myself that it's not just, I don't know, anecdote and confirmation bias on my
Sure.
own part. But I do think you're right, and that is something that gives me hope that there's sort of a sense of among a lot of people wherever you fall on, and look, I'm on the sort of affirming side of kind of LGBTQ inclusion questions, big supporter of women's ordination. So on the kind of hot button, I guess, sort of church social issues, I am on the progressive, liberal, whatever you want to call it, side, which is why I'm in the Episcopal Church and not, the ACNA or something like that. So I think that's right. I think the thing that I do worry about is the latter bit, the sense that, well, yeah, sure, push comes to shove, we believe this, but we're not going to make it the main thing either, because we are, either because anything doctrinally specific or any normative pattern of life of, sort of prayer and scripture reading and that sort of thing, or any kind of normative ethical vision or judgments, is going to sort of smack of fundamentalism for people that are sort of fleeing difficult upbringings with the church. Or, as you say, in this sense that, well, we need to, double down on doing the opposite of whatever the religious right is. To both of those, I think I would probably say, well, I mean, again, first of all, if your primary goal is advancing a kind of particular political vision in the world, especially sort of a left one, the mainline churches aren't actually the place to do that, right? Like I was a union organizer actually in the hotel industry before becoming a priest. So spent years and years of my life in that world, and like if I saw my primary vocation in this point as sort of fighting for this worldly justice, I'd still be working for the union. I wouldn't be a priest. It's not to say that the church has nothing to say to politics. It's not even to say that I'm in Canada now, so a little bit removed from the kind of day to day of the U.S. political news. But it's not to say that there aren't things happening in the States right now that the church. Sorry, I'm getting confused about my double negatives. It is to say, we'll do it this way. It is to say that there are things going on in the States right now that the church certainly should be speaking out about. But if we're going to make this, I mean, just at the level of institutional self-interest, if we're going to continue to exist, and what I would say sort of more theologically, if we're going to deserve to continue to exist, if we're going to be worth, preserving the Jesus, and not just Jesus as the, person who we kind of, in some sort of Feuerbachian way, kind of read into all our desired, ethical meanings, but just blown up, but the Jesus who comes to be our savior is the one who has to be at the heart of what we do.
Yeah, I'd be curious. You inhabit a different place in the church than I do. How are these, if you're having these conversations with any of your peers, I'd be curious, what do those go like? Are you getting a lot of pushback on these ideas? Are you getting a lot of excitement, a mix? Yeah, how are your thoughts being received?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a mix. By and large, I think I feel fortunate, to have had, sort of generally well-received thoughts, a lot of really kind of gracious and interesting, not sort of uncritical, but broadly sympathetic conversations, whether specifically about the vision of reclaiming this sort of account of historic Protestant Anglicanism, or more broadly just a more unashamedly Christian church. I think there are, as you sort of, you said, and I sort of mentioned, I mean, I do think one of the challenges for Anglicanism right now, specifically mainline Anglicanism, although I actually think this is true in like the ACNA as I understand it as well, is that we are so much a church of converts, and often a church of refugees, that can lead to, on one hand, people who are sort of, again, in the kind of, as you were saying, sort of classic kind of post-deconstruction milieu, who are still being sort of very nervous about a church that forcefully articulates much of anything. Or on the other hand, whatever background people are coming from, a sense that a desire to more or less have whatever they had in that sort of earlier church body, rather than kind of trying to take in Anglicanism at its on its own. And fundamentally, as I said, fundamentally, it's a good thing that we are welcoming to many people that don't have a home elsewhere. I think the challenge is how to sort of receive people like that with care and with gratitude for the particular sort of gifts and experiences and backgrounds they bring, while also being willing to say that, that Anglicanism or Christianity broadly isn't just a wax nose, isn't just whatever you want it to be, but is an invitation to enter into, well, one particular way to God, and more importantly, enter into the God who has sort of come down to us. So I think that's sort of one bit of negative pushback. I think the other thing that I think about a lot, that I'm actually planning some writing on, although it's a tricky thing to know how to write about well. One of the challenges, I think, for us right now, and one of the ways that I, as somebody whose day job is a PhD student, not a priest, actually have some freedom to think about these things, is just the day to day grind of trying to prop up collapsing institutions, right? And like, that's not super sort of sexy theological, anything like that. But I think there are, a number of people who might be like, well, yeah, Ben, this sounds great, but like, I'm trying to, keep the building from falling down and keep, and then sort of go provide pastoral care for my people, and then sort of, visit the people that are sick or in hospital, or this sort of thing. And then obviously those are all important things to do. I'm not saying you shouldn't do this, but I do think, there's some opposition. The bigger variety of sort of less positive responses are, I think, a sort of sense of just exhaustion, coming out of existing in an institution that's in rapid and increasing decline, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's not exactly a pretty picture. For mainline churches in general, a lot more funerals than baptisms right now, and that doesn't seem to be changing in the near future. I'd be curious on a personal level then, what gives you hope as a priest? I mean, I imagine you knew this when you signed up for the gig, right?
I did.
You were under no pretense that
I did.
you were on this rocket ship to the moon. What gives you hope?
Yeah, I think the thing above all that gives me hope for the future of this church, or these sort of this family of churches, is, despite its all too often lukewarmness and, barely functionality, and, sort of all of these other things, that I have seen people either sort of come to Jesus for the first time, or have kind of moments of reconversion. I mean, conversion's a lifetime process, right? Of sort of constantly coming deeper through this way of being Christian. And it's certainly been my story too. I think one of the great gifts that the Anglican tradition has to offer those who are part of it, certainly, again, this is true for me, is our pattern of daily prayer. I mean, we're not the only sort of Christians that do daily prayer, right? I mean, liturgical daily prayer, Orthodox, Catholics, also do some other, forms of kind of magisterial Protestant, and evangelicals, Pentecostals of their own sort of kind of less formal, but also, often quite structured and, if you will, liturgical, sort of daily piety. But the particular way that our service just steeps me day in and day out in psalmody and to scripture, that it sort of invites me to be converted to God anew, to repent, to hear the good news of forgiveness, and then to praise. I mean, I think that is the thing that sustains me day in and day out more than anything else. Or rather, I should say, the Spirit working through that is the thing that sustains me, more than anything else. And yeah, I mean, it's been a precious gift for me, and it's one that I'm eager to share with others. And I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter that much to me if somebody is an Anglican versus some other kind of Christian. But like, I have found abundant life in Christ here, and I want to share that, and I think that others can too.
Well, that seems like the best reason to be a priest. So I really appreciate that answer. And I can say that it resonates a lot for me and my wife and our
Mhm.
experience in the Episcopal Church. I feel like so much of it has just been the Book of Common Prayer and how meaningful that's been for us to do morning and evening prayer, and also, I feel like I've had this very idyllic experience of the Episcopal Church.
Mm.
Um, we attend this historic parish in Baltimore that has I mean, it's not as big as I'm sure it once was, but there's a good number of
Mhm.
people that really reflect the neighborhood it's in. It's a beautifully
Mm.
diverse church that's doing a lot for the
Mm.
community with a priest who really cares about the gospel. And I just feel like, wow, this was this was
That's
easy. I
beautiful.
wouldn't even know that everything's on fire. This is great. No, but it has been a wonderful experience for us. While you're here, I want to shift gears just a little bit to talk about, you mentioned a couple things here. You said that it doesn't particularly matter, to you whether people are Anglican or some other form of Christian. You talked a bit about just kind of, where Anglicanism finds itself within the Christian tradition, as well as tracing back to the beginning of our conversation where we talked about how the 39 articles is in this interesting place of being, reformed, but not getting into the weeds of all those things. What I want to talk about with that long preamble is just what exactly the Anglican Church is. We were discussing before we were recording that you're working on your PhD dissertation on kind of the relationship between early Anglicanism, I think like Elizabethan period, I think you said,
Mhm.
and the
That's right.
Continental Reformers. It's often described as like a via media, that it's this middle way between Roman Catholicism on the one hand and other forms of Protestantism on the other hand. Do you like that term? Is that what is that getting and what does it miss? I feel like this should get to the heart of some of your interests.
I It's a great question. I strongly dislike that term.
Oh, good. I love strong
At
opinions.
least as at least as a historical description of the Church of England at the time of the Reformation, it's absolute nonsense. It's not how anyone was thinking about things, and frankly, it's just not true. Now, it is the case that you will find some people in the 16th century talking about Anglicanism, or well, they're not using the word Anglicanism. That term is a later invention, but the Church of England, shall we say, as occupying this sort of middle ground between two extremes. But the thing is, all the theologians in the 16th century are reading Aristotle, and so all the theologians in the 16th century want to position themselves as the golden mean, apart from erring extremes on either side, right? Like you can find this in across the Protestant spectrum. You can find this in Catholic thinking. Sometimes you'll even find some Anabaptists sort of using this language. Now, when people in the Church of England in the 16th century use this language of the sort of moderate middle, what they mean typically, and I think this is a pretty good way of understanding actually what Anglicanism is, at least in this period, and what I think it should be, is it's sort of aligned with the other churches of the magisterial Reformation. And magisterial, by the way, sort of meaning kind of state church. So the kind of the Reformed, mostly Lutherans, opposed to sort of Anabaptists on one side, who in their view are usually kind of overly biblicist, among other things, but that's usually the root of in the sort of 16th century perspective. That's usually the root of the problem with Anabaptism, is kind of a faulty hermeneutic. So with positioned in opposition to Anabaptism on one extreme and Rome on the other. So it's not Anglicanism between Protestantism and Catholicism. It's the churches of the magisterial Reformation between Rome and sort of radical Protestantism, Anabaptism, something like that. The way that I think of what Anglicanism is, at the very least in the period I study, and the way that the people I study think about it, is a church of the Reformation that leans Reformed on the questions that divide Reformed from Lutheran, but is sort of moderately. So I would say Protestant, Augustinian, Protestant, moderately Reformed. That's sort of the identity of the Church of England, at least, yeah, until the end of the 19th or early 20th century, in a nutshell.
That's really helpful, and it would seem that it's interesting to me that one thing you don't note there is the governance of the church, which I think would be for a lot of people the thing that distinguishes the Anglican Church from the magisterial reformers. Is that overly simplistic, do you think, to say, because someone might add to that list, and they like bishops, they're kind of reformed, they like bishops, and
Yep.
kind of Catholic liturgy. Is there a problem with emphasizing that aspect of it?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So there are a couple. So, on one hand, yes, this is something that is distinct but not unique about the Church of England amongst the family of Reformed or Reformed and Lutheran churches in the period. The question is, how important that is, right? And this, to be fair, is something that even in the period I study, there is sort of a lot of disagreement about. But to say not unique, I think it's often forgotten, but worth remembering that among Reformed churches, for example, the Reformed Church in Poland kept bishops. I think the Hungarian Church did too. I should know that. That's embarrassing. The the Reformed churches in German-speaking Switzerland had a structure of church authority that some English writers sort of analogized to bishops. Among the Lutherans, then, the Lutheran churches in Scandinavia sort of preserved bishops, even calling the office of bishops. And many of the churches in what is now Germany, sort of in kind of the German-speaking world, they typically changed the name to superintendent, or the German equivalent thereof. But of course, I mean that's just a Latin way of saying bishop, right? It's the same thing, which again is something that people are pointing out at the period. And this is really what I'd like to stress, is that both what we can see looking at the various forms of church polity at the time and what the people that I study saw very, very clearly is that the Church of England's having bishops did not set them apart necessarily from other Protestant churches. The division that they did see in the period was between those who thought that the only way to organize a church by God's law was Presbyterian, versus those who said this is not a matter of divine law. Churches have some freedom to sort of organize the church as they will. And so this, for example, Richard Hooker, when he's one of the people I study, often treated as the founding father figure of Anglicanism. He has no problem with bishops, but certainly doesn't think they're necessary for the church, and sees the big problem with his Puritan opponents as that they claim that God has set down a single necessary form of church polity. He thinks this is not what the Bible's for. The Bible's not giving us this. That God has given us freedom to order the church. And bishops are good. They're apostolic. They're historic. We should probably keep them if we can, but they're certainly not necessary. Now, towards the end of the Elizabethan period, interestingly enough, in response to these Presbyterian arguments, you do have sort of conformist or Episcopalian people in the Church of England starting to argue for a higher vision than someone like Hooker had, starting to argue, no, bishops actually are the way that God wanted the church to be organized. But in Anglican history, this position, this very high view of the episcopacy, only actually emerges in response to this high view of the presbytery from Presbyterians. And then it's really out of the context of this long struggle with Presbyterianism that it begins to assume, an increasingly significant role. But even as late as the 19th century, it's not really until the rise of the Oxford movement, Anglican Catholicism, that you have a very sizable party in the Church of England that is nervous that churches that don't have bishops, that aren't episcopally organized, sort of aren't true churches. So even those who say, well, yeah, we think this is how you should do it, will generally still have a fairly generous read of these other Protestant churches, and the idea that no bishop, no church, to put it a little crudely, um, you know, nobody in the period I study is going to say that, and I would argue that in Anglicanism, that's bits in the 18th, but largely shows up in the 19th century.
Now that's just fascinating to me because in the world that I inhabit online, there's a lot of people arguing for whatever church, right? And there's a not insignificant camp that is in the Protestant world that then says, okay, yes, we're Protestant, but the real some of the only real Protestants are the Anglicans because the Anglicans have apostolic succession and the rest of you don't. So you guys might be in trouble there. And what's just fascinating to me is to see that, that's not a necessarily original Anglican argument. It's not historic to the period of the founding of it, that it's influenced by the Oxford movement, and probably not a coincidence that not an insignificant number of Oxford movement people with arguments like that eventually became Catholic. I mean, Newman was just declared a doctor of the church.
That's right.
Kind of
Newman, of course. Yep. That's
yeah,
right.
Really fascinating
That's right.
stuff.
No, I think that's exactly right. You'll have this, people will say, because this does, debates about succession happen a lot between Protestants and Catholic polemicists in this period. And the stock response from, somebody like, I don't know, Bishop John Jewel, for instance, Bishop of Salisbury, and sort of one of the key defenders of the Church of England in the reign of Elizabeth, he won't try to say, no, we have a succession too, it's fine. He'll just say, no, that's silly. Succession is succession in doctrine. That's what actually matters.
That is really interesting. And it relates, I think, to the earlier conversation we were having of for the Anglican Church to be more Anglican, I guess, along the Re-Confessionalization lines. It sounds like part of it's being more okay with being Protestant. Is that fair to say that it's...
Yeah,
okay.
That's absolutely fair to say.
Well, that's really helpful, and I think a good takeaway for people. I know we're just about at our time here, but I would love for you to maybe...
Can I say one thing about that, actually,
before we go on? You can say all the things. I've got all the time.
So amazing. So I think it's worth stressing. Look, I'm a history nerd. It's what I do. I'm doing a church history Ph.D. It's, I think, an argument for this sort of reconfessionalization is to, yes, pay more attention to or give us the ability to engage more deeply with a sort of wider portion of the Anglican past. But I think this is really important. The reason that I think Anglicans should be more okay with being Protestant isn't just because it's our history, but it's to come back to that conversation about Christ as gift, Christ as example, that I think, without saying obviously that if you're, not Protestant, you're not Christian or something like that. But I do think that the Protestant tradition at its best uniquely articulates the graciousness of God's gift of himself to us in Christ Jesus. And that, at the end of the day, far more than the history, is why I think this matters, because I think this helps us point people. It has certainly helped me be pointed to the good news of a gracious God. And at the risk of getting a little homiletic on you, that's what it's all about, I think.
Oh, that is so good. And I mean, the channel is named Gospel Simplicity after all, and I feel like you have captured that quite well. I received no shortage of comments telling me that the name is ironic due to the complexity of the topics, but I'm glad that we could land there. I think really just the last thing that I want to cover is, for those people who are listening to this and are excited, not least of which is myself. So this is a selfish question. But what kind of resources do you recommend? If someone's saying, wow, like I'm really into this vision. Okay. I want to see, a Re-Confessionalization, a Re-Christianization, specifically of the Anglican Church. But, this could be applicable to others too, who are just interested from the outside. But I know you're doing a ton of reading in this topic. You've talked about, Hooker and Jewell and various figures, but obviously, reading the articles, the returning to the Book of Common Prayer, all of these things are going to be important. But are there any figures that you think are particularly helpful to be looking to, or that have inspired you on the way?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I think I'd say to start with, yes, spend time with the articles, spend time with the prayer book, spend time reading the older prayer books, even if they're not what you're using for sort of day-to-day worship, which is of course fine. Read the homilies. No one reads the homilies. Some of them are forgettable, but some of them are really good. The homily on salvation and the homily on scripture, both in the first book, those are just really, really solid. Give a specific shout out resource wise to, I have my sort of well worn copy here, to the 1662 International Edition of the Book of Common Prayer that InterVarsity puts out. It's sort of a very light adaptation of that 1662 prayer book, which is still the official prayer book of the Church of England, to make it prayable for those who are not subjects of His Majesty King Charles, as well as making a few minor linguistic updates. And actually, it includes one of those sermons that I just mentioned, the homily on salvation or justification. That's really great. Those guys actually, Drew Keane and Sam Bray, the people who edited that, put out a really, really, really good book called How to Use the Book of Common Prayer. That is, at one level, a guide to that prayer book, but more than that is, I think, a quite profound meditation on the theological vision of Anglicanism as expressed in the prayer book. So yeah, I would totally grab those. Scholars like Ashley Null has done a lot of work on Thomas Cranmer. I have a ton of respect for him. And he's written some more sort of popular level stuff. My own PhD supervisor, Torrance Kirby, his stuff tends to be a little more academically pitched, but if you're into that, he has done some really phenomenal work on Richard Hooker. I think the kind of Mockingbird Ministries crew, the Zoll brothers, is in some ways sort of more Lutheran inflected, but I think is also sort of interested in a kind of Protestant approach to contemporary Anglicanism. So they're worth spending time with. And then the other thing, and I should actually put this together on my Substack sometime, a good sort of intro reading list with some links. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the kind of foundational texts from the early period of Anglicanism are not in print, or if they are, it's these sort of academic presses, and it's exceedingly exceedingly expensive. But a lot of this stuff is actually available for free online. Old kind of 19th century Google Book scans, and so there really are a lot of ways to yeah, to read stuff for free, which is pretty amazing. And last and probably least, actually, I will, if you don't mind, plug my Substack,
Of course.
bencrosby.substack.com. Is a place where I'm trying to have these conversations, and so if it's something you'd be interested in, I would be thrilled to have you around.
Well, Father Ben, this has been an absolute pleasure. I will certainly link to your Substack below, as well as to the various resources you mentioned. I will just echo the shout out for the IVP 1662 edition. I have one, enjoy it greatly. And I've also enjoyed your Substack. So thanks for all that you're doing. Thanks for your time today. This has been an absolute joy.
Well, thanks so much, Austin. I've really enjoyed it too.